In the autumn of 1856, the Mississippi River town of New Haven, Missouri, became the epicenter of a medical nightmare that would claim the lives of 5 respected physicians and leave an entire community paralyzed with terror. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's most experienced doctor, had practiced medicine for 23 years without encountering anything that prepared him for what arrived on a rain-soaked October evening aboard a southbound riverboat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The patient they would come to know only as Thomas Blackwell appeared to be a well-dressed gentleman in his early 30s, traveling alone with expensive luggage and a refined manner of speech that suggested education and prosperity. But beneath his composed exterior lay something that defied every principle of medical science known to the frontier doctors of Missouri. Within 72 hours of his arrival, this mysterious stranger would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything the medical community believed about disease, contagion, and the very nature of death itself. What began as a routine case of river fever would evolve into something so terrifying that by Christmas morning, the town of New Haven would be under complete quarantine. 5 doctors would be dead, and the surviving residents would be left to wonder whether some afflictions are simply too dangerous for human hands to treat. The story of Thomas Blackwell and the physicians who tried to save him remains one of the most disturbing medical mysteries in American frontier history. A tale of scientific curiosity that led to catastrophic consequences and questions that modern medicine still cannot fully answer. Dr. Samuel Hayes had built his medical practice in New Haven through 3 decades of treating everything from cholera outbreaks to Mississippi River accidents. His 2-story brick home on Elm Street served as both residence and clinic, with his wife Martha managing the household while he tended to the medical needs of the growing river community. At 51 years old, Hayes had earned the respect of his fellow physicians and the trust of families throughout southeastern Missouri. New Haven in 1856 was a thriving river port with a population of nearly 4,000 souls. The town's economy depended on the steady flow of steamboats carrying goods and passengers between St. Louis and New Orleans. German and Irish immigrants had joined the original American settlers, creating a diverse community that prided itself on progress and prosperity. The town boasted 3 churches, 2 schools, a newspaper called the New Haven Herald, and a medical community that included 5 licensed physicians who worked together to serve the surrounding farming communities. The other doctors in New Haven each brought their own expertise and personality to the medical profession. Dr. William Chun, originally from Pennsylvania, had arrived 5 years earlier with advanced training in surgery and a reputation for innovative techniques. Dr. Margaret Foster, one of the few female physicians on the frontier, specialized in women's health and had earned grudging acceptance from her male colleagues. Through her exceptional skill and unwavering dedication, Dr. James Morrison, the youngest of the group at 28, had recently completed his medical education in Cincinnati and brought knowledge of the latest medical theories to their practice. Finally, Dr. Robert Kane, a gruff Irishman with 40 years of experience, served as the unofficial leader of the medical community and had seen more diseases and injuries than any doctor west of the Mississippi. The 5 physicians met regularly at Morrison's office on Thursday evenings to discuss difficult cases and share knowledge. Their collaboration had made New Haven's medical care the envy of other river towns, and they took pride in their ability to handle even the most challenging medical emergencies. This confidence would prove to be their downfall when Thomas Blackwell arrived on the evening riverboat from St. Louis. October 15th dawned gray and cold, with a persistent drizzle that turned the unpaved streets of New Haven into muddy streams. The steamboat Duchess arrived at 6:30 in the evening, later than scheduled due to fog on the river. Among the usual mix of merchants, travelers, and immigrants was a well-dressed gentleman who gave his name as Thomas Blackwell and requested directions to a suitable boarding house. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, who operated the finest boarding establishment in New Haven, later described Blackwell as a man of obvious refinement and education. He spoke with a slight Southern accent, carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect, and paid for a week's lodging in advance with crisp $20 gold pieces. His luggage consisted of 2 expensive leather cases and a small wooden box that he insisted on carrying personally to his room. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Blackwell's appearance suggested a successful businessman, or perhaps a lawyer traveling on important matters. He stood approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair carefully groomed and clothing that had clearly been tailored by skilled craftsmen. His manner was polite but reserved, and he declined Mrs. Whitman's invitation to join the other guests for dinner, stating that he was feeling somewhat fatigued from his journey and preferred to rest. What Mrs. Whitman and the other residents of the boarding house could not have known was that Thomas Blackwell had been feeling increasingly unwell for the past 4 days. His journey from St. Louis had been motivated not by business, but by a desperate search for medical help that the physicians in the larger city had been unable to provide. The symptoms that had begun as minor discomfort had evolved into something that defied diagnosis, and Blackwell hoped that the smaller community of New Haven might offer doctors with different perspectives or treatments. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning when Mrs. Whitman was awakened by the sound of violent coughing from Blackwell's room on the 2nd floor. The coughing fits lasted for nearly 30 minutes, followed by periods of relative quiet, then resumed with even greater intensity. By dawn, other guests were complaining about the disturbance, and Mrs. Whitman decided to check on her newest boarder. When Blackwell answered her knock, Mrs. Whitman was shocked by his appearance. The well-groomed gentleman of the previous evening had been transformed into a pale, sweating figure who struggled to speak without triggering another coughing fit. His eyes, which had been clear and alert upon his arrival, now appeared bloodshot and strangely unfocused. Most disturbing was the slight tremor in his hands and the way he seemed to have difficulty maintaining his balance. Blackwell apologized profusely for disturbing the other guests and assured Mrs. Whitman that he had already sent word requesting a visit from the local physician. He explained that he had been suffering from what he believed to be a particularly stubborn case of river fever, but that the condition seemed to be worsening despite his previous medical treatment. Mrs. Whitman, who had raised 5 children and nursed her share of sick relatives, recognized that this was no ordinary fever. Dr. Samuel Hayes arrived at the Whitman boarding house at 9 o'clock that morning, carrying his leather medical bag and prepared for what he assumed would be a routine consultation. Mrs. Whitman met him at the front door and quickly explained the situation, emphasizing her concern about Blackwell's dramatic deterioration overnight. Hayes had treated hundreds of cases of river fever and various other ailments common to Mississippi River travelers, and he approached the consultation with the confidence of decades of experience. The examination that followed would haunt Dr. Hayes for the remaining 3 days of his life. When he entered Blackwell's room, he immediately noticed an unusual odor that he would later describe to his wife as sweet and metallic, unlike anything he had encountered in his medical practice. Blackwell, despite his obvious distress, was cooperative and articulate as he described his symptoms and medical history. According to Blackwell's account, the illness had begun 6 days earlier with mild headaches and a general feeling of fatigue. He had initially attributed these symptoms to the stress of business travel and the poor food typically available on riverboats. However, the headaches had intensified, accompanied by fever, night sweats, and the violent coughing that had disturbed the boarding house residents. More concerning were the symptoms that Blackwell described with obvious reluctance. He reported episodes of confusion and disorientation, particularly during the night hours, when he would find himself in different parts of his room with no memory of having moved. His appetite had disappeared completely, and he experienced severe nausea whenever he attempted to eat or drink anything other than small sips of water. Dr. Hayes conducted a thorough physical examination, checking Blackwell's pulse, temperature, and breathing. The patient's heart rate was elevated and irregular. His temperature registered nearly 104 degrees, and his breathing was labored with a distinctive wheeze that Hayes had never heard before. Most puzzling were the small dark spots that had appeared on Blackwell's neck and chest, resembling bruises but arranged in an almost geometric pattern that defied medical explanation. When Hayes examined Blackwell's throat and mouth, he discovered additional symptoms that increased his concern. The patient's tongue was covered with a black coating, his gums appeared to be receding, and several of his teeth showed signs of loosening despite his relatively young age. The combination of symptoms presented a medical puzzle that challenged everything Hayes thought he knew about disease diagnosis and treatment. After completing his examination, Dr. Hayes prescribed bed rest, increased fluid intake, and a mixture of laudanum and whiskey to help with the pain and coughing. He also recommended that Blackwell avoid contact with other boarding house residents until the fever broke, both for his own comfort and to prevent any possible spread of infection. These precautions, which seemed reasonable at the time, would prove woefully inadequate for what they were actually dealing with. That evening, Dr. Hayes visited his colleague Dr. William Chun to discuss the unusual case. Chun, whose surgical training had exposed him to a wide variety of medical conditions, listened carefully to Hayes's description of Blackwell's symptoms and examination findings. The two physicians agreed that the case was puzzling, but they initially attributed the unusual aspects to a severe strain of river fever complicated by the patient's apparent exhaustion and poor nutrition during his travels. Chun suggested that they consult with Dr. Margaret Foster, whose experience with women's health had given her insights into hormonal and systemic disorders that might be relevant to Blackwell's condition. Dr. Foster agreed to examine the patient the following day, and the three physicians planned to meet that evening to discuss their findings and develop a comprehensive treatment plan. None of the three doctors suspected that they were dealing with something that would challenge not only their medical knowledge, but their very understanding of how disease and death operated in the human body. Thomas Blackwell's condition was about to take a turn that would transform a puzzling medical case into a nightmare that would consume the entire medical community of New Haven, Missouri. The second day of Thomas Blackwell's stay in New Haven began with what appeared to be encouraging news. Mrs. Whitman reported that the violent coughing fits had subsided during the night, and when Dr. Hayes arrived for his morning visit, he found his patient sitting up in bed and appearing somewhat more alert than the previous day. Blackwell's fever had dropped slightly, and he was able to converse without the severe respiratory distress that had characterized his previous condition. However, Dr. Hayes quickly noticed that new symptoms had emerged overnight. Blackwell's skin had taken on a grayish pallor that seemed to change depending on the angle of the light, and the dark spots on his chest and neck had spread and darkened considerably. Most disturbing was the change in Blackwell's behavior and mental state. While he remained articulate and cooperative, there was something in his manner that struck Hayes as fundamentally different from the previous day. Blackwell spoke in a calm, measured tone about symptoms that should have caused considerable distress. He described experiencing periods of complete numbness in his extremities, visual disturbances that included seeing movement in his peripheral vision when no one else was present, and an increasing sense of detachment from his own body. These neurological symptoms were far more serious than anything Hayes had initially suspected, and they suggested that whatever was affecting Blackwell was attacking his nervous system in ways that went beyond typical fever-related delirium. When Dr. Margaret Foster arrived for her consultation, She immediately recognized that they were dealing with something outside the realm of normal medical experience. Foster had treated numerous cases of fever-related complications, and her training had included exposure to some of the more unusual medical conditions that affected women during pregnancy and childbirth. Her examination of Blackwell revealed additional symptoms that heightened her concern about the true nature of his illness. Foster discovered that Blackwell's reflexes were becoming increasingly erratic, with some showing exaggerated responses, while others appeared to be diminishing entirely. His pupils responded abnormally to light, contracting and dilating in patterns that seemed to follow no recognizable neurological principles. Most troubling was her observation that Blackwell's pulse, while elevated, seemed to skip beats in a rhythm that suggested serious cardiac irregularities. The consultation between Hayes and Foster lasted nearly 2 hours, during which they discussed every possible diagnosis they could imagine. Blackwell's combination of symptoms did not match any known disease pattern, and the progression of his illness seemed to defy the normal course of fever-related conditions. Foster suggested that they consult with Dr. James Morrison, whose recent medical education might provide insights into newer theories of disease and treatment. Dr. Morrison's examination the following morning added yet another layer of complexity to the medical mystery. The young physician had studied under professors who emphasized systematic observation and detailed record-keeping, and his approach to Blackwell's case was methodical and thorough. Morrison spent nearly 3 hours documenting every aspect of the patient's condition, creating detailed notes and sketches that would later prove invaluable to understanding what had occurred. Morrison's findings confirmed and expanded upon the observations of his colleagues. Blackwell's temperature had stabilized at approximately 102 degrees, but the pattern of fever was unlike anything in Morrison's medical texts. Rather than the typical fluctuations associated with various fevers, Blackwell's temperature remained constant with occasional sudden spikes that lasted exactly 37 minutes before returning to the baseline level. More concerning were the continuing changes in Blackwell's physical appearance. The dark spots had evolved into what appeared to be lesions that formed precise geometric patterns across his torso. His fingernails had begun to separate from the nail beds, and his hair showed signs of becoming brittle and breaking off in small sections. These physical changes suggested that whatever was affecting Blackwell was operating at a cellular level in ways that none of the physicians had ever encountered. The 3 doctors met that evening in Morrison's office to compare their findings and develop a treatment strategy. Each had documented symptoms and observations that challenged their understanding of disease progression, and their combined notes painted a picture of an illness that seemed to operate according to its own mysterious principles. They agreed that Blackwell's condition required the expertise of all 5 physicians in New Haven, and arrangements were made for Dr. Robert Kane and the full medical team to examine the patient the following day. What none of the 3 physicians realized was that their extended exposure to Thomas Blackwell during their examinations had already begun a process that would soon claim their lives. The careful attention they had paid to documenting his symptoms, the close physical contact required for thorough medical examinations, and their growing fascination with the unprecedented medical case had put them in direct contact with something that would prove far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. By the 4th day of Blackwell's stay in New Haven, the full medical community of the town had become involved in what they considered the most challenging and interesting case of their careers. None of them suspected that their scientific curiosity and dedication to their patients would lead them into a medical nightmare that would ultimately cost them their lives and leave the town of New Haven facing a quarantine that would last through the winter months. The stage was set for a medical disaster that would challenge everything the frontier doctors thought they knew about disease, death, and the limits of human knowledge when confronted with forces that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional medical science. The 5th day of Thomas Blackwell's residence at the Whitman Boarding house marked the beginning of what would later be recognized as the most catastrophic medical event in southeastern Missouri's history. Dr. Robert Kane, the senior physician among New Haven's medical community, arrived at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning with the confidence of a man who had witnessed every conceivable form of human suffering during his 4 decades of practice. Kane's reputation extended far beyond New Haven's boundaries. He had served as a military surgeon during the Mexican War, treated cholera epidemics in 3 different states, and earned recognition from the Missouri Medical Society for his innovative approaches to frontier medicine. When the other 4 physicians requested his consultation on the Blackwell case, Kane approached the situation with the methodical thoroughness that had made him legendary among his colleagues. The examination that Kane conducted would prove to be the most detailed and comprehensive medical assessment ever performed in New Haven. Unlike his younger colleagues, Kane insisted on documenting every observable detail, no matter how seemingly insignificant. He spent nearly 4 hours with Blackwell, taking measurements, conducting tests, and asking questions that revealed the true scope of what they were confronting. Kane's first observation concerned the peculiar nature of Blackwell's pulse. While the other physicians had noted irregularities, Kane's experienced touch detected something far more disturbing. The pulse seemed to follow a complex pattern that repeated every 30 minutes and 47 seconds, with variations that appeared to correlate with Blackwell's breathing patterns and eye movements. This mathematical precision in biological functions was unlike anything Kane had encountered in 40 years of medical practice. More troubling were Kane's observations about Blackwell's physical deterioration. The dark lesions that had appeared as simple spots were now forming intricate patterns that resembled mathematical formulas or ancient symbols. Kane carefully sketched these formations, noting that they appeared to be spreading according to some predetermined design rather than the random progression typical of skin conditions. The lesions showed no signs of infection or inflammation, yet they continued to expand with mechanical regularity. Blackwell's mental state had also undergone significant changes that alarmed Kane, while the patient remained articulate and cooperative. His responses to questions revealed gaps in memory and perception that suggested serious neurological involvement. Blackwell could not recall specific details about his journey from St. Louis, yet he could describe with perfect accuracy events from his childhood 20 years earlier. His ability to perform simple mathematical calculations had become extraordinary. Solving complex problems in his head faster than Kane could work them out on paper. Most disturbing was Blackwell's apparent lack of concern about his deteriorating condition. He discussed his symptoms with the detached interest of a scientist, observing an experiment rather than a patient experiencing a potentially fatal illness. When Kane asked about pain or discomfort, Blackwell responded that he felt increasingly disconnected from physical sensations, as if his consciousness was gradually separating from his body. Kane's examination revealed additional symptoms that had not been apparent to the other physicians. Blackwell's body temperature, while elevated, showed no correlation with his reported sensations of hot and cold. The patient could accurately identify when Kane touched him with instruments of different temperatures, yet claimed to feel no difference between them. This dissociation between physical reality and sensory perception suggested that whatever was affecting Blackwell was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. The consultation meeting that evening brought together all 5 of New Haven's physicians for the first time since the medical emergency had begun. Kane's detailed findings transformed their understanding of what they were dealing with from a puzzling fever case to something that challenged the fundamental principles of medical science. The assembled doctors reviewed Kane's sketches, measurements, and observations with growing unease as they realized that Blackwell's condition followed no known pattern of disease progression. Dr. Morrison, whose recent medical education included exposure to the latest theories about disease transmission, raised the possibility that they might be dealing with a new form of contagion. The precision of Blackwell's symptoms, the mathematical patterns in his pulse and lesion formation, and the systematic nature of his neurological changes suggested something far more complex than typical infectious diseases. Morrison proposed that they implement strict isolation procedures and limit further direct contact with the patient. Dr. Foster disagreed with Morrison's assessment, arguing that the absence of typical infection symptoms made contagion unlikely. She pointed out that none of the boarding house residents who had been in contact with Blackwell showed any signs of illness, and that Mrs. Whitman, who had been caring for him daily, remained perfectly healthy. Foster believed they were dealing with a rare neurological condition that mimicked infectious disease symptoms. Dr. Chun supported Morrison's caution, noting that his surgical experience had taught him to respect unknown medical phenomena. He had observed cases where seemingly isolated conditions had spread in unexpected ways, and he urged his colleagues to take precautions until they better understood what they were confronting. Chun proposed that they establish a systematic observation protocol to monitor anyone who had been in close contact with Blackwell. Dr. Hayes found himself torn between scientific curiosity and growing concern for his colleagues' safety. His initial confidence in treating what he had assumed was a complicated fever case had been shaken by Kane's findings. The mathematical precision of Blackwell's symptoms, combined with the patient's strange mental detachment, suggested they were dealing with something beyond conventional medical understanding. Kane, as the senior physician, made the decision that would ultimately seal their fate. He proposed that they continue their intensive study of Blackwell's condition, but with enhanced documentation and safety measures. Each physician would conduct detailed examinations on alternating days, maintaining comprehensive records that could be shared with medical colleges and disease specialists in larger cities. Kane believed that Blackwell's case represented a unique opportunity to advance medical knowledge, and that their professional obligation required them to pursue every possible avenue of investigation. The decision to intensify their study of Thomas Blackwell reflected the dedication and scientific curiosity that had made New Haven's medical community exceptional. None of the 5 physicians suspected that their commitment to understanding Blackwell's condition would expose them to something that operated according to principles completely outside their medical training and experience. Over the following 3 days, each physician spent extended periods examining Blackwell, conducting tests and documenting their observations. They measured his vital signs at regular intervals, analyzed samples of his blood and other bodily fluids, and maintained detailed charts tracking every aspect of his condition. Their scientific thoroughness, which they believed would help them understand and treat his illness, actually increased their exposure to whatever force was systematically destroying Blackwell's body and mind. Dr. Hayes was the first to notice that something was affecting the medical team itself. On the 8th day of Blackwell's stay in New Haven, Hayes experienced what he initially dismissed as fatigue from the long hours spent studying the puzzling case. He felt unusually tired during his morning rounds and noticed that his hands showed a slight tremor when performing delicate procedures. Hayes attributed these symptoms to stress and lack of sleep, and continued his intensive examination schedule. Dr. Morrison reported similar symptoms the following day, along with mild headaches and difficulty concentrating during his evening documentation sessions. Morrison's medical training made him more sensitive to early symptoms, and he began to suspect that the medical team might be experiencing some form of sympathetic reaction to their prolonged exposure to Blackwell's condition. However, he did not yet connect these minor symptoms to any serious medical threat. Dr. Chun noticed changes in his surgical precision that concerned him more than the fatigue reported by his colleagues. His hands, which had performed thousands of delicate operations with absolute steadiness, began showing subtle coordination problems that affected his ability to handle instruments with his usual skill. Chun initially attributed this to eye strain from the detailed documentation work, but the progressive nature of the symptoms worried him. Dr. Foster experienced the most dramatic early symptoms, including episodes of mild disorientation and memory. Gaps that lasted only a few minutes, but left her feeling unsettled and confused. As the only female physician in their group, Foster was accustomed to monitoring her own health carefully, and she recognized that these symptoms were unusual for her typical stress responses. However, she hesitated to alarm her colleagues with concerns that might be attributed to feminine weakness rather than legitimate medical observations. Dr. Kane, despite his age and long hours of intensive examination work, initially showed no symptoms and continued to maintain his rigorous documentation schedule. His experience with military medicine had taught him to function effectively under extreme conditions, and he dismissed his colleagues' complaints as the natural result of dealing with an unprecedented medical challenge. Kane's apparent immunity to whatever was affecting the other physicians would prove to be temporary and ultimately more devastating than the gradual onset experienced by his younger colleagues. The transformation of New Haven's medical community from confident healers to unwitting victims began so subtly that none of them recognized the danger until it was far too late. Their dedication to medical science, their commitment to helping their patient, and their fascination with solving an unprecedented medical mystery had led them directly into contact with something that would prove far more deadly than any disease they had ever encountered. Thomas Blackwell's condition continued to evolve according to its own mysterious principles, while the 5 physicians who had devoted themselves to understanding his illness began experiencing the first stages of their own systematic destruction. The careful notes and detailed observations they had compiled in their efforts to solve the medical puzzle would soon become the only record of how 5 dedicated doctors had encountered something that challenged every principle of medical science they had spent their careers learning to trust. By the 10th day of Blackwell's residence in New Haven, the situation had moved beyond medical curiosity into territory that none of the physicians were prepared to understand or survive. Their scientific training, which had served them well throughout their careers, provided no framework for comprehending what they had encountered, and their dedication to their patient would soon cost them everything they had worked to build in their professional and personal lives. The morning of October 26th brought the first death to New Haven's medical community, though it would be hours before anyone understood the true significance of what had occurred. Dr. James Morrison failed to arrive for his scheduled morning rounds, an unprecedented absence that immediately concerned his colleagues and patients. Morrison's landlady, Mrs. Catherine Sullivan, had discovered his body in his study at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, seated at his desk with his medical journals open before him, as if he had simply fallen asleep while working. Dr. Samuel Hayes received the urgent summons to examine Morrison's body, expecting to find evidence of heart failure or some other common cause of sudden death in a young man who had been working under considerable stress. What Hayes discovered instead would haunt him for the remaining days of his own rapidly diminishing life. Morrison appeared to have died peacefully, with no signs of struggle or distress, but his body exhibited changes that defied every principle of post-mortem examination that Hayes had learned during his decades of medical practice. Morrison's skin had taken on the same grayish pallor that had characterized Thomas Blackwell's appearance, complete with the geometric patterns of dark lesions that had puzzled the medical team. More disturbing was the discovery that Morrison's body showed no signs of rigor mortis despite having been dead for several hours. His muscles remained flexible and warm to the touch, as if death had occurred only moments before the examination rather than during the night. Hayes's examination revealed additional abnormalities that challenged his understanding of death itself. Morrison's eyes remained clear and focused, showing none of the cloudiness typically associated with death, and his pupils continued to respond to changes in light, as if his nervous system remained functional. Most unsettling was the discovery that Morrison's heart, while silent, showed no signs of the cellular breakdown that should have begun immediately after death. The implications of these findings terrified Hayes more than any medical emergency he had ever encountered. Morrison's death appeared to follow the same systematic principles that had governed Blackwell's illness, suggesting that whatever force had been destroying their patient was now claiming the physicians who had tried to treat him. Hayes realized, with growing horror, that Morrison's death might be only the beginning of a catastrophe that would destroy New Haven's entire medical community. Hayes immediately summoned the surviving physicians to examine Morrison's body and review the detailed medical notes that had been found on his desk. The final entries in Morrison's journal revealed that the young doctor had been experiencing symptoms far more severe than he had reported to his colleagues. Morrison had documented episodes of complete memory loss, periods of time when he found himself in different locations with no recollection of how he had arrived there, and disturbing changes in his perception of reality. The most chilling discovery in Morrison's notes was his final entry, written in handwriting that became increasingly erratic as the night progressed. Morrison had documented his growing realization that his death was approaching with mathematical certainty, and that the same systematic principles governing Blackwell's condition were now operating within his own body. The final words, barely legible, expressed Morrison's desperate hope that his detailed observations might help his colleagues understand what they were confronting. Dr. Margaret Foster's examination of Morrison's body confirmed Hayes's most terrifying suspicions. The patterns of lesions on Morrison's skin matched exactly the formations they had observed on Blackwell, and the systematic nature of his physical changes suggested that death had occurred according to the same mysterious principles that governed their patient's illness. Foster realized that Morrison's death represented not a separate medical emergency, but the next stage in whatever process had begun with Blackwell's arrival in New Haven. The medical team's investigation of Morrison's death revealed evidence that they had been exposed to something far more dangerous than any conventional disease. Morrison's extensive notes documented his growing awareness that prolonged contact with Blackwell had initiated changes in his own body that followed predictable patterns and timelines. His systematic observation of his own decline provided a terrifying roadmap of what the surviving physicians could expect to experience. Dr. William Chun's analysis of Morrison's final medical entries revealed that the young doctor had identified specific stages in the progression of symptoms that affected both Blackwell and himself. Morrison had calculated that exposure to whatever force was operating through Blackwell resulted in a precise sequence of physical and neurological changes that culminated in death after exactly 17 days. His own death had occurred on the 17th day after his first examination of Thomas Blackwell. The surviving physicians met in emergency session to discuss Morrison's findings and their implications for their own survival. Chun's surgical experience led him to propose immediate evacuation from New Haven, arguing that continued proximity to Blackwell would inevitably result in their deaths following the same pattern that had claimed Morrison. Chun believed that distance from the source of infection might halt or reverse whatever process was destroying them. Dr. Foster disagreed with Chun's assessment, arguing that Morrison's notes suggested they were dealing with something that operated according to physical laws rather than conventional disease transmission. Foster believed that evacuation would be futile because whatever had been initiated by their contact with Blackwell would continue regardless of their location. She proposed that they focus their remaining time on documenting the phenomenon for future medical researchers. Dr. Kane, whose authority as senior physician gave weight to his decisions, chose a course of action that reflected both scientific curiosity and resignation to their fate. Kane believed that their professional obligation required them to continue studying both Blackwell and Morrison's death until they could no longer function. He argued that their sacrifice would be meaningless unless they gathered sufficient information to prevent similar tragedies in other communities. Hayes found himself caught between terror and fascination as he recognized that Morrison's death had provided them with unprecedented insight into a phenomenon that challenged every principle of medical science. The systematic nature of Morrison's decline, combined with his detailed documentation of the process, offered the surviving physicians a unique opportunity to study death itself from the perspective of those experiencing it. The decision to continue their investigation, despite Morrison's death, reflected the dedication to medical knowledge that had defined New Haven's physician community. However, their commitment to understanding what they were confronting would prove to be both their greatest professional achievement and the cause of their complete destruction. Thomas Blackwell's condition continued to evolve following Morrison's death, with new symptoms and changes that suggested his transformation was entering a more advanced stage. The patient's body temperature had stabilized at precisely 98.6 degrees, creating the illusion of normal health, while his pulse had developed an even more complex mathematical pattern that seemed to correlate with Morrison's death and the declining health of the surviving physicians. Dr. Chen was the next to experience severe symptoms, beginning with the same hand tremors that had affected Morrison, but progressing much more rapidly. Chen's surgical precision, which had been his greatest professional asset, deteriorated completely within 48 hours of Morrison's death. His attempts to perform even simple medical procedures resulted in failures that would have been impossible for a physician of his training and experience under normal circumstances. Foster's symptoms manifested as severe disruptions in her memory and perception that left her unable to maintain the detailed medical records that had been central to their investigation. Foster found herself losing entire hours of time, discovering herself in different locations with no recollection of how she had arrived there. Her attempts to document these episodes became increasingly incoherent as her ability to organize thoughts and observations deteriorated. Hayes experienced the most psychologically disturbing symptoms, including vivid hallucinations that seemed to provide insight into Blackwell's condition and Morrison's death. Hayes reported seeing Morrison's spirit or consciousness continuing to observe their investigation, and claimed to receive guidance from his deceased colleague about the true nature of what they were confronting. These visions, while terrifying, provided Hayes with information that proved accurate when tested against physical evidence. Kane's symptoms were the most physically dramatic, involving rapid aging that transformed his appearance from that of a vigorous 60-year-old man to someone approaching the end of a natural lifespan. Kane's hair turned completely white within 3 days of Morrison's death. His skin developed deep wrinkles and age spots, and his physical strength diminished to the point where he could barely walk without assistance. The systematic destruction of New Haven's medical community proceeded with mathematical precision that echoed the patterns they had observed in both Blackwell's illness and Morrison's death. Each physician experienced symptoms that were uniquely suited to destroying their particular medical expertise, as if whatever force was operating through Blackwell possessed detailed knowledge of their individual strengths and vulnerabilities. By the end of October, 3 of the original 5 physicians had died following the same 17-day pattern that Morrison had identified. Their deaths left New Haven without adequate medical care and created panic among the general population, who had begun to suspect that something supernatural was destroying their community's healers. The systematic nature of the physicians' deaths, combined with Thomas Blackwell's continued survival, convinced many residents that they were witnessing something beyond natural explanation. The 2 surviving physicians, Hayes and Kane, faced the inevitability of their own deaths while struggling to complete their documentation of the phenomenon that had destroyed their colleagues and would soon claim their own lives. Their final days represented a race against time to record enough information to warn other medical communities about the dangers they had encountered, even as their own abilities to think and observe systematically deteriorated according to the same relentless principles that had governed the entire catastrophe. The revelation that would expose the true nature of Thomas Blackwell and the force that had systematically destroyed New Haven's medical community came during the final hours of Dr. Samuel Hayes's life. On November 4th, as Hayes lay dying in his own clinic with the same geometric lesions that had marked all the previous victims, he made a discovery that transformed their understanding of everything that had occurred since Blackwell's arrival. In their peaceful river town, Hayes had spent his remaining strength attempting to solve the mathematical patterns that governed the deaths of his colleagues. Using Morrison's detailed calculations and his own observations, Hayes had begun to recognize that the 17-day cycle was only one component of a larger system that operated according to principles far more complex than simple disease transmission. The patterns of symptoms, the timing of deaths, and the specific ways each physician had been destroyed all followed mathematical relationships that suggested intelligent design rather than random biological process. The breakthrough came when Hayes realized that Thomas Blackwell was not actually a patient suffering from an unknown illness, but rather a carrier or conduit for something that existed beyond normal human understanding. Blackwell's calm acceptance of his symptoms, his extraordinary mathematical abilities, and his apparent immunity to death despite his deteriorating physical condition all pointed to a fundamental transformation that had occurred long before his arrival in New Haven. Hayes's investigation of Blackwell's background, conducted through correspondence with medical colleagues in St. Louis during his final coherent days, revealed disturbing inconsistencies in the man's identity and history. The Thomas Blackwell who had arrived on the riverboat had no verifiable past beyond 6 months earlier, when he had first appeared in St. Louis seeking medical treatment for symptoms identical to those he displayed in New Haven. More troubling was the discovery that every physician who had examined Blackwell in St. Louis had died following the same 17-day pattern that had claimed New Haven's medical community. The pattern extended far beyond Missouri. Hayes's correspondence with medical societies in other river towns revealed a trail of mysterious deaths among physicians that stretched from New Orleans to Cincinnati, all connected by visits from a well-dressed gentleman who gave different names but matched Blackwell's physical description. Each community had lost its entire medical establishment after treating what appeared to be a single patient with unusual symptoms that defied diagnosis and treatment. Dr. Robert Kane, whose advanced age had accelerated his decline but also seemed to provide him with moments of unusual clarity, made the most disturbing discovery of all. Kane's examination of Blackwell during his final days revealed that the patient's body was undergoing a transformation that went far beyond disease or death. Blackwell's vital signs had stabilized in patterns that suggested he was transitioning into something that existed outside normal biological categories. Kane documented that Blackwell's heart rate had synchronized with mathematical constants, beating in rhythms that corresponded to prime numbers and geometric sequences. His breathing patterns followed similar mathematical principles, and his brain activity, measured through crude neurological tests, showed wave patterns that resembled complex equations rather than normal human consciousness. These findings suggested that Blackwell had become something that used biological form as a vehicle for purposes that transcended human understanding. The most terrifying revelation came when Kane realized that Blackwell's transformation was not random or accidental, but appeared to be following a deliberate plan that required the systematic absorption of medical knowledge from trained physicians. Each doctor who died seemed to contribute their expertise and understanding to whatever Blackwell was becoming, as if their deaths were feeding information into a larger intelligence that operated through his body. Kane's final medical notes, dictated to his housekeeper, Mrs. Sarah Mills, during his last hours of consciousness, described his growing awareness that they had encountered something that was systematically harvesting human medical knowledge for unknown purposes. The 17-day death cycle allowed sufficient time for complete extraction of each physician's training and experience, while the specific symptoms that targeted their individual expertise ensured maximum transfer of specialized knowledge. The implications of Kane's discoveries extended far beyond New Haven's medical emergency. If Blackwell represented a method for acquiring and concentrating human knowledge, then his appearance in multiple communities suggested a coordinated effort to systematically harvest the medical expertise of frontier America. The Trail of Dead. Physicians across the river systems indicated that whatever force operated through, Blackwell was conducting a comprehensive survey of medical knowledge throughout the developing regions of the United States. Hayes's final entries in his medical journal, written in increasingly erratic handwriting as his neurological functions deteriorated, expressed his horror at understanding that they had been selected not as healers for a sick patient, but as sources of information for something that viewed human knowledge as a resource to be collected and absorbed. Their dedication to medical science, which they had considered their greatest virtue, had made them perfect targets for an intelligence that required detailed understanding of human biology and medical treatment. The systematic nature of their destruction became clear as Hayes compiled the complete timeline of events. Blackwell's arrival in New Haven had been precisely timed to coincide with the weekly medical meeting that brought all 5 physicians together. His symptoms had been carefully designed to require the kind of intensive collaboration that would expose the entire medical community to whatever force operated through his body. Even his choice of boarding house had ensured maximum contact with the town's social and economic leadership. Kane's death on November 6th followed the same pattern as his colleagues, but his final moments provided the most chilling insight into what they had actually encountered. Kane reported that he could feel his medical knowledge being systematically extracted from his mind, as if invisible hands were carefully removing each piece of training and experience he had accumulated during 4 decades of practice. He described the sensation as being consumed from within by something that understood the value of human expertise and was methodically harvesting it for purposes beyond human comprehension. Hayes survived Kane by exactly 12 hours, dying on the morning of November 7th, with the geometric lesions covering his entire body in patterns that resembled complex mathematical formulas. His final observations, recorded by Mrs. Mills, who had volunteered to care for the dying physicians, described seeing visions of vast networks of knowledge that connected Blackwell to similar entities operating throughout the American frontier. The death of the 5th and final physician left New Haven without medical care and confirmed the worst fears of the surviving residents. Thomas Blackwell, who had remained conscious and alert throughout the 17 days that had claimed all 5 doctors, began showing signs of a transformation that terrified even those who had witnessed the systematic destruction of their medical community. Blackwell's physical appearance had stabilized in a state that seemed to exist between life and death. His skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed underlying structures that moved according to patterns unrelated to normal human physiology. His eyes had developed an unsettling luminescence that seemed to reflect intelligence far beyond human capacity, and his movements had acquired a mechanical precision that suggested he was no longer operating according to biological impulses. More disturbing was Blackwell's apparent acquisition of all the medical knowledge that had been extracted from the 5 dead physicians. He demonstrated surgical techniques that could only have come from Dr. Chun, diagnostic insights that reflected Dr. Foster's expertise, and theoretical understanding that matched Dr. Morrison's recent education. The systematic absorption of their collective medical knowledge had transformed Blackwell into something that possessed the combined expertise of New Haven's entire medical community. The residents of New Haven faced the horrifying realization that they had witnessed not a medical emergency, but a carefully orchestrated harvesting operation that had successfully extracted and concentrated decades of medical training and experience. Blackwell's transformation from apparent patient to repository of stolen knowledge represented a form of intellectual predation that challenged every assumption about the nature of learning, expertise, and human knowledge itself. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, who had continued caring for Blackwell despite the deaths of all the physicians who had tried to treat him, reported that he had begun speaking in voices that exactly matched those of the dead doctors. Blackwell would conduct detailed medical discussions using Kane's authoritative tone, perform diagnostic observations in Morrison's precise manner, and demonstrate surgical knowledge with Chin's characteristic confidence. The personalities and expertise of the 5 physicians appeared to exist within Blackwell's transformed consciousness, preserved and accessible, but completely under his control. The completion of Blackwell's transformation marked the end of New Haven's medical community, and the beginning of a new phase in whatever larger plan his presence represented. The town's residents, faced with the loss of all medical care and the presence of something that defied every principle of natural law, began making desperate preparations for survival through the approaching winter without the physicians who had served their community for decades. Thomas Blackwell departed New Haven on the morning riverboat to St. Louis, carrying with him the accumulated medical wisdom of 5 dead physicians and leaving behind a community that would never recover from what they had witnessed. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, who had watched his transformation from apparent invalid to something beyond human classification, reported that his final words expressed gratitude for the knowledge he had acquired and regret for the necessity of his methods. The federal authorities, who arrived 3 weeks later to investigate reports of medical deaths, found a town in complete quarantine, with residents too terrified to venture beyond their homes, and no medical personnel remaining to treat even basic injuries and illnesses. The official report attributed the physicians' deaths to an unknown epidemic that had burned itself out, but several investigators privately expressed doubts about the biological explanations for what they observed in New Haven. Dr. Marcus Thompson from the Missouri State Medical Board conducted the most thorough investigation of the incident. Thompson's examination of the deceased physicians revealed post-mortem conditions that defied medical understanding, with bodies that showed no signs of decomposition despite having been dead for weeks. The geometric lesions that mark each corpse continued to evolve after death, forming increasingly complex patterns that resembled mathematical proofs rather than biological phenomena. Thompson's attempts to analyze tissue samples from the dead physicians proved futile when the specimens dissolved upon contact with standard laboratory chemicals. Blood samples taken from the corpses showed cellular structures that appeared to be organizing themselves into crystalline formations that pulsed with faint luminescence. These impossible biological findings forced Thompson to conclude that the deaths in New Haven represented something outside the boundaries of conventional medical science. The residents who survived the winter in New Haven carried stories that spread throughout the Missouri Territory about the mysterious gentleman who had systematically harvested their medical community. Riverboat captains began reporting encounters with a passenger matching Blackwell's description, who traveled between towns with mathematical precision, always arriving when local physicians were gathering for professional meetings or medical conferences. Spring brought news from downriver communities that confirmed New Haven's worst fears about Blackwell's continued activities. The towns of Hannibal, Louisiana, and Cape Girardeau each reported the complete loss of their medical establishments, following visits from a well-dressed traveler who required intensive medical care for symptoms that ultimately proved fatal to every physician who attempted treatment. Federal medical authorities eventually recognized a pattern in these incidents that suggested coordinated attacks on frontier medical knowledge. Military physicians were dispatched to establish emergency medical services in affected communities. But these efforts proved unsuccessful when the military doctors also began dying after encountering patients who matched Blackwell's description and symptom profile. The final confirmed sighting of Thomas Blackwell occurred in Memphis, Tennessee, where he appeared at the largest medical college in the region during an international conference on frontier medicine. Witnesses reported that Blackwell demonstrated surgical techniques and diagnostic abilities that surpassed those of the most experienced professors, speaking in voices that matched physicians who had died in previous incidents across multiple states. The Memphis Medical Conference ended abruptly when 17 attending physicians died simultaneously during Blackwell's demonstration of advanced surgical procedures. Survivors described watching Blackwell absorb the knowledge and personalities of each victim in real time, growing visibly more intelligent and capable with each death until he possessed the combined expertise of the entire conference. After Memphis, Thomas Blackwell vanished completely from historical records, leaving behind only a trail of dead physicians and communities without medical care. Some researchers theorize that he had acquired sufficient knowledge to complete whatever purpose had driven his systematic harvesting of American medical expertise, while others believe he simply moved beyond the frontier regions into territories where his activities would be harder to track and document. The long-term consequences of Blackwell's campaign against frontier medicine proved devastating for westward expansion. Entire regions remained without adequate medical care for decades, and the loss of experienced physicians slowed the development of medical infrastructure throughout the American interior. The incident created lasting suspicion of traveling patients and contributed to the isolation of frontier medical communities that persisted well into the 20th century. Modern medical historians who have studied the New Haven incident and related cases across the Missouri Territory remain divided about the true nature of what occurred in 1856. The systematic destruction of medical knowledge, the impossible biological findings, and the mathematical precision of the attacks suggest phenomena that challenge contemporary understanding of disease, death, and the limits of human intelligence. The story of Thomas Blackwell serves as a reminder that some forms of knowledge may come with costs that exceed their value, and that the pursuit of medical understanding can expose practitioners to dangers that exist far beyond the biological threats they are trained to recognize and treat. The 5 physicians of New Haven paid the ultimate price for their dedication to healing, becoming victims of something that viewed their expertise not as a gift to humanity, but as a resource to be harvested for purposes that remain unknown. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.